everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Heritage or Hogwash, a podcast about the intersections of classics and the far right. My name is Asclepius, and I'll be guiding us through our first topic, the myth of race. But first, let's meet our other hosts.
Hello, I'm Hermes.
My name is Hestia.
And I'm Libertas.
Between the four of us, we have experience in the fields of sociology, Hellenic and Roman classics, English literature, pre- and post-Christian religious studies, and history from the Middle Ages to the modern period.
To those who know us in person, you may have noticed that our names are a little different. Far-right communities online can be hostile to projects like this, and we want to protect ourselves and our loved ones, so we're using aliases for this project and hiding our identities as best we can.
The intent of this project is to identify and analyze some of the common rhetoric and strategies among the far right as it pertains to the use of material from Greco-Roman antiquity. This connection is a lot more common than you might think. We want to empower people to engage critically with stuff like Greek and Roman myth, historical events, and modern politics, and particularly the cultural conversations surrounding these topics. The conversations are nuanced and complex and will involve a lot of concepts that we'll strive to explain as we go. We'll be providing examples and case studies where possible to demonstrate these concepts, and each episode will be guided by one of us and shaped by our individual expertise.
We'll be talking about some heavy topics in every episode, so we'll be giving warnings at the top of each one. We're striving to keep our language academic, which makes it sterile, so that we're not taking anything lightly, and we aren't discussing the concepts in an inflammatory or disrespectful way. However, we'll be defining all our terms to keep things accessible to a general audience, so just know that no basis of knowledge in these fields of study is required.
Before I dive into telling everyone about how race isn't real, I wanted to ask you all about things you've heard about race in online circles and what you've been told in your personal lives about the construction of race or racial ideology.
Well, if I may, in the colloquial, race usually just refers to skin color. White, black, brown.
That's a good way of starting, yeah.
Particularly in sort of gateways into far-right rhetoric, I see a lot about race traitors, like people who are betraying the supposed ideals or goals of their race, usually through intermarriage or promoting racial equality or things like that.
Yeah, miscegenation is a really big topic in this that I don't get too into because it goes into whole levels of complicated that we can't really address here.
This is going to sound somewhat strange, but growing up, I didn't really have any concept of race. I was very much raised in a community that, didn't differentiate treatment, which is great on one hand, but also meant I was completely ignorant to things like racial disparity until I was in, high school. I wish I was joking. I grew up with not a lot of diversity in my hometown, but the people of color that were there, it wasn't a distinguishing feature for me growing up to be like, oh, this is a different kind of person.
Interesting. It is super important how, when you're young, you begin to sort of understand that society is built to work against certain people. And the idea of not seeing color or not seeing race or not being aware of these issues quite early on can actually have adverse effects because you can come off as ignorant sometimes when someone is talking about what's going on in their lives. But to get back to it, race isn't real. You might have heard something along the lines of, race is a social construct. And while that's not untrue, it's a lot more complicated than that. We're going to be talking about some heavy topics like scientific racism, white supremacist narratives, the justification of these narratives, as well as some Nazi rhetoric, and those topics can be distressing. Do what's best for you. This episode is about the myth of race, but we want to explain some big concepts before we get into the nitty-gritty of race, disenfranchisement, gender, and xenophobia. Protect yourself, and buckle in. I'll begin by saying that race is not real. I can't state this strongly enough. There's no biological foundation for race as white supremacists would lead you to believe. However, people believe that race exists, so in a sense, it's a social reality. People's ideas about race inform their actions, which have tangible effects. So, let's define race in a way that has white supremacists and classical figures from antiquity on the same page. If we're going to do that, probably the best definition I can give you is that a race is a group of people who are believed to share imagined common characteristics, physical, mental, and or moral, which can't be changed by choice because they're thought to be determined by some unalterable physical characteristics. That definition implies some inherent biological factors, though. I'm not saying that that's correct, but that's what people who believe that race exists would define as race, or they would agree with it in part. But who are these people I'm talking about that believe in race? Most people. Most people believe that race exists in some way. And it's not inherently harmful to believe that. However, some people believe that their racial category is better than other racial categories, and we tend to call these people racist. In the Western world, these people are generally white supremacists. They believe that the values and morals and physical characteristics of the white race are superior in some way. They also believe that these values and characteristics are inherited directly from Greece and Rome. Anthropologist Thomas C. Patterson outlines the beliefs of white supremacists, stating that their elites, quote, coined the idea that civilizations are always class-stratified, state-based societies, and civilized peoples always belong to the classes whose privileged existences are guaranteed by the institutions and practices of the states. That's wordy. But to break it down a little bit, society is stratified by groups of people who decide that they're better than others, and that the privileged ones create institutions that guarantee their continued existence. That definition of civilization works for white supremacists just fine. Society stratified into hierarchies, and they, as white people, are privileged, so their existence is guaranteed. If you swap the wording around being state-based to something about being governing bodies of some kind, you could apply that definition to the classical world. Both Greece and Rome had institutions and practices that upheld the differences between wealthy elites and slaves, as well as between men and women. However, white supremacists believe that there's an inherent racial quality to that hierarchy that isn't present in the classical world like they would want you to believe it is. Peter Frost is a renowned writer in far-right circles, and also an anthropologist, and he uses Tacitus and Julius Caesar's accounts of Germanic marriage customs to argue something similar about these ideas of stratification, but gives some justification behind it. He claims that white Europeans are, quote, more individualistic, less loyal to kin, and more trusting of strangers. He then asserts that this is why white populations are susceptible to replacement by non-white people who focus more intensely on their own genetic ethnocentrism. In episode 3 of this podcast, Hestia is going to get more in depth about the biological component of this, the race, the way that women factor in. I'm going to focus a little bit more about culture and the race war idea. Essentially, because white supremacists are self-interested in the continuation of their own race, they believe that every other race thinks about this too, and that there is a necessary component of war, or that war is already underway between the races. In his article, Western Civilization 101, philosopher Michael A. Peters goes on to explain how Enlightenment thinkers believe this too, but also that civilization implied participation in the state, and how, quote, communal virtues are an indispensable part of society, based on the social nature of human being. He then goes on to link this through with the German Jewish sociologist Norbert Elias's ideas about the civilizing and decivilizing process, based on the idea that societies go through cycles. This kind of thing opens the door to conversations about social atavism, or a tendency of reversion, or the ideas about the decline of culture that Libertas will get into in episode 4. I've said it a few times now, but white supremacist is a loaded term. When I say white supremacist, certain images are going to come to mind, namely people who cut eye holes in sheets and put cones on their heads and run around and burn crosses. The KKK, or groups like that. That makes sense. That's what we think of when we see white supremacist. However, there's ideas within these circles that it's probably going to be a good idea to distance themselves from such loaded terms. I've had the unfortunate experience of reading Cesar Lombroso's The Criminal Man from cover to cover. He believed that most criminals belong to a different species, Homo delinquens. It just so happens that he based this on science that would move most people of color out of the Homo sapiens category and into the Homo delinquens species. That specific idea was glossed over when the book caught on in North America, but his broad strokes were used to further criminalize and segregate black people in the Reconstruction era under Jim Crow laws. Part of what he talked about, yes, was the physical aspects of people that are inherited, but largely he talked about the culture of criminals. He believed that criminals, and subsequently people of color, were able to continue to exist because they had a cultural honor among thieves, that they made a concerted effort to ensure they would continue to exist. He did also believe that climate and altitude influenced your race, and therefore criminality, which was a commonly held belief in antiquity, especially by Greeks.
I will say, the Greeks, while they did have ideas that the environment could influence how someone developed, it was on a more individual basis. There wasn't a collective racial component to it.
Yeah, that sort of feeds into the idea of, well, this was a concept that did exist, kind of. It gets applied quite broadly.
They also believed that the alignment of the stars at your birth had something to say about your character.
Lombroso believed that criminality was stored in a tiny hole in the back of your skull, so to what extent can we call some of these ideas science is one thing, but there is definitely a lineage of interpreting interesting things to look at patterns on a societal scale. What logically follows as we move away from scientific ideas about race is ethnicity. As far as academia is concerned, race doesn't exist. But what I said about perceived characteristics does contribute to our understanding of ethnicity. A decent definition of ethnicity would be something along the lines of the social group a person identifies with or is identified with by others as a result of a mix of cultural factors, including language, diet, religion, ancestry, but also the physical features that are traditionally associated with race. My race, if I were to use racial terms, is white. But if I were to pick an ethnicity, it would be English. Ignore the nation of England. I'm not talking about my nationality. We'll get to nationality. My ethnicity is English. I speak the English language, as I am currently doing. I eat foods that English people eat, unfortunately. I was christened in the Church of England, and my ancestors would be part of the same ethnic category as me. Others also see the texture of my hair and my skin color and think white, which is associated with other English people.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, ideas about race are grounded in a perceived biological identity, the literal characteristics that you're allegedly born with.
Yeah.
And then ethnicity has more to do with a cultural identity, but both are inherited.
Yes, much in the same way that even your nationality can be inherited. The United States, actually, is one of the few countries that has birthright citizenship, where your nationality isn't inherited. You're only a citizen if you're born within the borders, or apply for citizenship later on. However, this hasn't always been the case, even in the US. Black slaves born in the United States were not considered citizens despite being born on US soil. Differently again, in ancient Greece and Rome, citizenship referred to a specific class of people, much like in the US before emancipation. White supremacists use the term race and ethnicity interchangeably, though, in the same way that people often use sex and gender interchangeably, despite most people now knowing that they're not the same. Race and nationality also became interchangeable for these groups in how they define their collective identity. For example, they don't consider Black Americans to be as American as white Americans, or even any other group of American.
If I might interject for a moment, could you expand a bit more on what the guiding principles were, then, for collective identity in the ancient world? You mentioned how collective identity in the modern day is defined by nationhood and racialization, and I know a little bit about how zealous the Greeks were about their city-states, particularly in interstate conflicts like the Peloponnesian War. It was all very competitive for them. My city is better than your city. But even then, any flavor of Greek was better than being not Greek. How does that factor into ideas like nationality and race?
For the ancient world, it was largely xenophobia, which is still present in the United States today, though it's largely based around culture now, and I'll get to that after answering your question. But it was mostly a fear of corruption. In the ancient world, they were pretty literal about foreigners, those that weren't part of the city-states or weren't Greek at large. Foreigners were a threat to being Greek, to the Greekness of society, and they thought that being Greek was the best thing that you could be. In the United States, the fear of the foreigner as a concept was part of the driving force behind the Muslim travel bans, and narratives about Mexicans piling in from the southern border.
Yeah, if I might add to this, the Roman idea was a bit more complicated. The Romans were much more willing to let people into their culture and society, even if they had to jump through a lot of hoops. You could become a citizen, usually through military service. And by the time of the late Empire, almost everyone who wasn't a slave was considered to be a Roman citizen. That is not to say, however, that there was no xenophobia, and the Romans could be very xenophobic and often cried very loudly for an influence.